Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, our subject is Soviet montage cinema of the 1920s, a new cinema for a new society. More specifically, we're going to be looking at Battleship Potemkin by Sergei Eisenstein. This film in 1958 was voted as the greatest film of all time. Now, almost 100 years old, we're going to look at it again and see what its relevance is for today. Joining us in that discussion will be Professor Stuart Liebman, Emeritus Professor of CUNY and a noted expert on the avant-gardes of the 1920s. Now, join the revolution in Battleship Potemkin. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed watching one of the grand classics of world cinema history, a film that in 1958 was voted as the greatest film of all time. For film historians, it remains in place as an incredibly important work, but it's slipped a bit from the public consciousness. Today, we're here to recover some of those amazing features of this film. And for that recovery operation, we have returning an old friend of City Cinematheque, Professor Stuart Liebman. Professor Liebman is Emeritus of CUNY from Queens College and the Graduate Center. He's a noted expert and widely published on the modernist avant-gardes of the 1920s. He's an associate editor of Cinéaste magazine, where he recently published a long essay on Esther Shub, the most important woman associated in many ways with the Soviet montage of the 1920s. Welcome back, Stuart.
Thanks, Jerry.
Great. So it's 100 years later, more or less, and I think we need to kind of recover what the objectives were of the Soviet cinema of this new country, the Soviet Union, which is less than 10 years old when this film is made. So what's the industry and what are its objectives when Eisenstein is making this film?
You know, when you asked me to participate in this program, I suddenly popped into my head this old ad for a fake fur. And the theme of the ad was, "What becomes a legend most?" Okay. And I thought, well, if you had to pick one person who is legendary in the history of cinema, it would be Sergei Eisenstein. Okay. And yet, as you pointed out in your introduction, he's no longer thought of as quite as important as he once was. Right. Certainly in the 20s, he was the king of the avant-garde, right. Especially the political avant-garde. And that has to do with both his personal beliefs and also the circumstances in which he became a filmmaker. Right. Eisenstein was a fervent supporter of the Bolshevik Revolution. He fought in the Civil War, although he was primarily an engineer, he wasn't shooting guns, and was passionate about theater. And he joined, adored the director Vsevolod Meyerhold, who was the head of the leading theatrical director of the time, who remained in the Soviet Union, one of the three. And Eisenstein gradually shifted over into cinema, actually helped by Esther Shub, who became a lifelong friend, who had become an editor earlier. He had met her in the Meyerhold group. Cinema for the early Soviet state was controlled entirely by the Ministry of Enlightenment, which was their Ministry of Education and public propaganda, essentially. And the aim was to politicize the cinema in a way that it had never been, to innovate in the cinema, with the aim of showing off the new Soviet Union, to provide a kind of mythos of its creation, Soviet Union's creation, and to export the ideals of revolution as they understood it. And in the early years, there was some tension between those in the old guard who had remained. There were relatively few, but those who had been formed in the pre-revolutionary cinema, and those who were young at the time. And you must remember that when Eisenstein began to learn how to edit in the cinema, he was about 24 years old.
Right. These key filmmakers are remarkably young at this time. Yeah.
Yes, all of them. Those who are going to be shown in the series, some were a little older than Eisenstein, like Potemkin, who was born in 1893, Eisenstein in 1898, and Kozintsev and Trauberg were slightly younger. So these are very, very young men who are thrust into incredible roles and given a certain latitude to do what they wanted to do, which was to radicalize the cinema. That ended within about 2 or 3 years after the Potemkin took the world by storm.
So I'm going to say something very, very simple. So if one of our viewers is saying, hey, this seems like Soviet propaganda, the answer is completely unequivocal. You're correct. This is exactly what this is up to. This is a cinema that is to promote the Soviet state, unambiguously, to a population that may not all have been converted to the goals of that particular revolution, as well as to export the image of the new nation and export the image of their kind of revolution globally.
What's interesting about the reception of Potemkin after its creation is a certain ambivalence within the Soviet Union itself.
Right.
And this was not the case abroad, where it was widely celebrated and contested by state authorities, especially in Germany, which was its first foreign stop. The effort to come to grips with it in the Soviet Union was marked by ambivalence by some of Eisenstein's friends.
Okay.
Kuleshov refused to comment on it when it was first out. Pudovkin made rather harsh criticisms of it. These were probably not forgotten by Eisenstein. These were all frenemies.
Right.
They had very strong opinions, and they were not afraid to voice them in public. But one of the final ironies is that they sold Goskino, which was the state industry, sold the film to Germany, which was then allowed to make all kinds of cuts in the film, much to Eisenstein's chagrin, I'm sure. But basically, they were able to exploit it the way they wanted to. And back in the Soviet Union, they allowed them to have copies. They wore out the copies, and this caused some consternation in Soviet intellectuals.
Let's talk about what makes this a Soviet montage film. So, I mean, that's the title of this series, Soviet montage of the 1920s, a new cinema for a new society. But when film scholars talk about Soviet montage, what do they or we mean?
Well, again, it's a function of context, and this establishes something about its stylistics. Up to the revolution, cinema was essentially in the pre-Soviet state, in Tsarist Russia, was essentially long takes of theatrical productions. This is well known. And the younger bucks in this group were not interested in that. And they saw the power of breaking up a scene into different shots and then recombining them in different ways to create new forms of meaning and new forms of intensity. This goes back to one of Eisenstein's slightly younger rivals, Lev Kuleshov, who basically developed what was known as the Kuleshov effect.
Talk about that.
Yeah. Basically, he took some existing footage of a pre-war actor named Mosfilm, who had emigrated to Paris and made films there. He then interposed different kinds of shots of a funeral, of some meal, and so on. And by simply juxtaposing the same shot of Mosfilm with these different separate shots, he was able to produce effects of Mosfilm is hungry, Mosfilm is very sad, and so on. And that concept radically developed across the entire 1920s,
Right.
culminating in Zika Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an unusual film for those of us who are used to whatever iteration from 100 years ago until the latest thing, released in a mall last weekend. There are ways in which the idea of what the structure of a film is and how we have a relationship with the characters in the film. This film we've just seen is very, very different in where it's coming from about those things. Let's start with the whole idea of who's a protagonist in a film. What sets Eisenstein and his ideas about that apart?
First of all, Eisenstein was making a film about the masses and supposedly for the masses.
Okay.
And the central characters here are the people of Odessa, then part of the Tsarist Empire,
Right.
now much contested, as we know. It is about an historical incident from the Revolution of 1905, which was part of the Soviets' effort to develop a mythical urge within Soviet society to actually overthrow the Tsarist regime. And the cruelty of the Tsarist military, and specifically the Navy, in mistreating their sailors. There was no particular one person, although Eisenstein stresses Vakulinchuk, who's
Right.
the martyred figure here. Basically, it's about the group of people in Odessa who come to support this kind of conversion to understanding and celebrating the revolutionary ethos. And the sailors themselves, after Vakulinchuk dies, quickly become irrelevant in terms of their individual personalities. Something, by the way, anticipating a later phase of Soviet cinema, becomes anathema in Soviet cinema, where individual efforts are celebrated, and Eisenstein does his best later on to defend himself because he had celebrated, but Vakulinchuk had separated him out, but he's a relatively shallow character.
Right. No, so this is a very interesting notion that you've brought up of two things. First of all, the way in which this revolt that happened in 1905 is being used, in this mythologizing you're talking about, is being used as a little bit of the Old Testament to the New Testament. Because, it was not the Bolsheviks who were running the 1905 revolution, but as they are, putting together their foundational myth about themselves, what they want to do is to say, these are incidents that in historical inevitability lead towards the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and then to the creation of the Soviet state. So, this is it is historical film, but it is a historical film that mythologizes in a particular way and makes how shall I put it? And makes connections of logic and causality that historians would dispute. From historians from many different angles, by the way, not just from like an anti-Soviet angle, but they just say, no, this was actually something different. But if you want, okay, you're purposing it that way.
Yeah, and by the way, the last film in your series, New Babylon, takes one step back further, which
Right.
is to Paris Commune, which all Soviets who were true believers see as one of the many, many anticipatory events that lead to this supreme revolution for all times, which we know didn't work out so well.
Yeah, exactly. No, this also brings up the question of the organization of the film and how almost every unit in this film could be taught in a film class or viewed by any spectator as a standalone unit, but almost every one of them is some form of conversion narrative, in which you begin with, in one case, with sailors literally asleep, and there's an awakening that happens from there. Or in another section you have a few people discover a body and then by the end of the section, an entire city seems to have discovered it. So even though the Soviets and the Bolsheviks are officially atheist, that's all part of who they are. They are using nonetheless the structure of a conversion narrative that is common to any number of religious traditions.
Yeah, well, your word conversion is exactly apt, because frankly, you'll see this, or your viewers will see this in the subsequent films in the series. Mat, Mother, which was based on a film on a book by Gorky, basically converts from being doubtful of revolution, and suddenly she sees what went wrong, and she converts. Same with the end of St. Petersburg and so on. So it is definitely a theme in so many books and films of the period.
Right, right. So let's talk a little bit more about how he organizes, the film in terms of editing. I mean, there's several very, very famous scenes in the film. It is, how shall I put it? It's a sort of standard of your teaching introduction to film analysis and editing. The Odessa step scene is many a professor across the nation has queued it up on YouTube.
Yes.
and has screened it. So why are we doing that? What makes the Odessa step scene so important?
Well, essentially, it is, of course, a fictional event.
Let's start there, sir.
That's right. And so he had a relative freedom to compose what in the Soviet Union was perceived to be a kind of musicalist interpretation of the event. That is to say, that the choice of shots, the length of shots, the alternation of shots between two opposing forces, the people, the innocent people standing on the steps, ordinary civilians caught up in this, and the Tsarist thugs, the Cossacks, who are going to kill them mercilessly.
Right.
So he's able to shoot from many, many different angles, ignoring certain conventions about keeping eye lines matched and so on and so forth, in order to generate a kind of intense effect of disorientation, of imposing a kind of point of view, a generic point of view, de-individualizing the Cossacks who are descending the steps and marching really down the steps methodically. Just an aside, when the film, before it had a score, it was accompanied, as so many silent films were, by piano accompaniment. And the young man who was part of Meyerhold's group, named Lev Arnstam, who was a pianist and was charged with actually writing a score for this, did the Bach's Art of the Fugue. And that was used as the musical accompaniment at that point. So this musicalist idea of combining different kinds of shots and different kinds of lengths is likened to a musical score that in fact does the same with the sound spectrum.
Well, this is also, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's also part of this whole notion, because you've already hinted at it or talked about it, that there's a new concept, there's a migration from an old concept of theater, that is a realist theater, through an avant-garde theater, that's developed, over into a cinema that's defining itself as definitively non-theatrical in its concept, not only of how it can fragment and reassemble space, but also, now you've touched on the way in which it can become musical. That is, that rhythmic effects within editing can be just as important as revelation of information itself. And I think that comes back to the nature of this particular kind of cinema as propaganda, because we can come back and talk about the fact that it genuinely is organized as an argument. Yes, there's a chronology in the film, but it's organized as an argument. But the conversion element in that argument is affective. It is to immerse us into the experience of the people who are being converted, so we will be converted with them. But it's an immersive, affective thing that is achieved through this, in many ways, the fragmentation, the rhythm, and the reassembly, rhythmic reassembly of the shots.
Yes, and I want to say that Soviet filmmakers of the time were not ignorant of primarily American films. Kuleshov basically called it Americanitis, a kind of disease in which in particular Griffith's innovations in editing for things like Birth of a Nation and so on, those are taken to be an instructive pointer towards what they ultimately achieved, which was a much freer and less narrative-directed combination of shots that would, as you say, affect people, unnerve people. And that was precisely why German censors, when they got a hold of the film, where did they attack? Precisely on the Odessa Steppes sequence, where they cut out many of the things that would intensify revulsion against the wanton slaughter of ordinary people.
Right. And of course, there's several reasons to study this, but, a modern action director whose, how shall I put it, historical, political, or whatever thematic position you want to call it, has nothing to do with Marxist revolution, can still be looking at these patterns of editing and these ways of evoking affect, and using them. There is no Sam Peckinpah, just to bring it back to America, there is no Sam Peckinpah in his westerns like The Wild Bunch, or there is no John Woo from Hong Kong without this kind of editing that's put in place, most particularly by Eisenstein, and I would say Vertov as well. So it's a global effect. And it returns again with you can go back 50 years with Peckinpah's films like Straw Dogs or the Wild Bunch, and they're exactly the same objections about the affective rendering of violence that the Germans are making in the 1920s.
Absolutely, yes. Eisenstein had a taste for this kind of violence, by the way. This is a personal matter with him. But he understood the power of these kinds of things. And I think nowadays with all the technological editing apps and so on that you can do at home now, Eisenstein did not have that luxury. I mean, everything was 35 millimeter. There was no 16 millimeter invented yet. And everything had to be done by trial and error. And when you're dealing with pieces of film, a meter long, which sounds like a long time, but it's really a second or two on screen, all of the organization of this was extraordinary. You see this in Man with a Movie Camera when Svilovov, the editor, actually lays out the different strips of film, and you see how small some of them are.
Well, and the fact is, we think when we say cut, we just don't even think about it in the sense that we're just using it metaphorically. Oh, it's when they move from this. But when you were in that editing room, or you see it as portrayed in Man with a Movie Camera, you see they are literally cutting film, and splicing and gluing, etc. So this is a really remarkable achievement to do something like the moment when the sailor looks at the dish and then throws it, and that's handled in multiple cuts. That and one can link that to cubist renderings, in painting at the time. But that's really remarkable if you look at the more theatrical films. Wait, that's a single action of the movement of an arm, and he's cutting it to pieces and taking it from different angles so that the anger is expressed through that reassembly.
Kind of wrenching quality to the way the editing works at that moment. And you're literally jerked to a kind of attention. That happens many, many times.
What other scenes would you point? We've got just like a minute. Or the other things that you would.
Well, there are contrasting episodes. Famously, the morning in the fog that Tissé insisted on filming. It's a kind of calm before in the storm.
Right, absolutely.
It was highly celebrated at the time as one of the most beautiful sequences in the history of movies. It seems a little odd today, but at the time this was not normal. And by the way, it had echoes in many films in France, atmospheric evocations of particular places.
Okay. So I think we're going to have to end there on the way in which this film has an incredible range of emotions attached to it, even as it is making its argument, you know, for the glories of the Soviet Revolution. If you like what we've been doing here today and talking about Soviet montage, we'll be talking about it more in coming weeks, as well as we're always returning to talk about film history here on City Cinematheque. If you'd like to know more about us, please visit our website, www.tv.cuny.edu. There you're going to find the schedule of City Cinematheque, ways to communicate with us by email, and you'll be able to look at all of the other programming we have here across the board at CUNY TV. So visit www.tv.cuny.edu. Stuart, always a pleasure to have you here with your treasure trove of knowledge of these things. That's all. Hope we'll be continuing this conversation on another topic sometime soon. Okay?
Always available, Jerry.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us today on City Cinematheque. And please join us again as we continue to stroll through the archives of film history. Bye for now.